Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. And as you know from watching this show, occasionally we like to do something a little out of the ordinary. Tonight, we're going to travel back in time, back to Elizabethan times. Our guest tonight is Anne Elizabeth Shapera, otherwise known as Jane the Fool.
Well met at once, Master Kevin. Well met indeed.
Well, Jane, thank you so much for being here.
Gramercy for allowing us entrance to this excellent place.
And so here we go. We'll start right out by saying vocabulary has certainly changed since Elizabethan times.
It really has.
So gramercy, what would be the modern equivalent of that?
It's a contraction of God grant you mercy. So it's thank you, or I'm very grateful to you.
Let's ask the question that I think must be on most people's mind, which is, why do you dress up like this?
I portray a 16th century court jester, and my portrayal is based on an actual 16th century fool who was originally fool to Mary Tudor and then eventually to her sister Elizabeth.
Both queens of England.
Both queens of England. Elizabeth, the first queen of the Britons to bear that name. Queen of England, Ireland, Wales, France, and the Virginias, et cetera, et cetera. And the Jane the Fool that lived was possibly slightly less well-dressed than I, but there are historical records showing that of all of Elizabeth's jesters, Jane was the best attired. She had 12 new pairs of shoes every year, whereas most people had shoes.
Well, I can't think of a better segue to ask you to please stand up. And let's get a full look at the outfit. Do a little turn for the camera, and we can see.
This is not my actual backside. What I like to tell my audience is that this is just fashion. Don't be frightened. If this were my actual backside, you would receive instruction as to where to seek shelter in the event of accidental detonation. But it's actually a garment called a bum roll, but mine's so big I've named it. I call it bum rollio.
It is its own unique individual by now, right?
Exactly. He's got my back. He's my sort of Shakespearean epic friend.
So in Elizabethan times, how long would it have taken Jane to get dressed like this?
Jane would probably take about an hour to get dressed, and she would also probably have been amongst the first of the royal household to get dressed every morning. She would need to be dressed before the Queen's ladies were dressed in time to dress Her Majesty, who, by the way, got up at 6 o'clock every morning to dance galliards before breakfast, which is a really energetic, kicking dance. So
it was her morning exercise.
Exactly. Every morning she danced 6 galliards before breakfast. So.
And a galliard is
it's this really high-stepping dance with a sort of a rhythm and it's very fast-paced, and it involves lots of athletic leaping into the air.
So why would Jane have had to be dressed before any of the ladies in waiting for the Queen?
Her Majesty's jesters were not only entertainers, but they were also considered advisors. Even jesters like Jane. The actual Jane the Fool was what we today would consider differently mentally abled. She was a natural fool. The Elizabethans made a distinction between artificial fools, who were clowns or comedians or jugglers or practiced entertainers, and naturals, who were retained because of their simplicity. The Elizabethans felt that people who were differently mentally abled, as we would call them today, were touched by God for an unknowable purpose. So maybe they were a bit oracular, maybe their simplicity would lead them to speak simple truths that others would hide through ambition or through desire for
Actually, it seems like a remarkably progressive concept.
It is and it isn't, because, of course, that invariably leads to people of different abilities being treated as pets.
Yes.
For example, Her Majesty had little people. She had up to 12 dwarves at any one time in her reign.
Who were very much like pets to Her Majesty?
Exactly. There was a competing monarch of the era, Catherine de' Medici, who had a fleet of dwarves, and definitely gave them great privilege, but also everyone was pretty clear that they weren't actually people.
That would be
awkward.
Yes, that's the dark side of it.
Very dark.
But it is interesting to think of people who have what we would consider disabilities, but might in fact have been seen as purposeful acts of God, and that there was some offset. much like savant syndrome today.
Exactly. Exactly. Beatrice Otto, who is published through the University of Chicago Press, has a book called Fools Are Everywhere. And it's a cultural history of fools and jesters in every culture throughout history. And in particular, she talks about the nature of the fool as an oracle or as a trusted advisor, because the fool lacks ambition. You know, if somebody has an advisor who's an earl, they'll always want to be a duke. If they have an advisor who's a baron, they always want to be an earl. Queen's fool is pretty much the top of the game.
Yes,
you know, it doesn't get any better than that. So you know that the advice that you're getting from that person isn't based on, if I flatter you, you will give me things. It's just, well, I have nothing to lose. Here's my opinion.
Now, I had read somewhere many years ago that the fool was so valued in the court because the fool was the only one who could speak the truth to the king or the queen, as the case may be.
That is exactly it. Absolutely. Definitely valued. Wouldn't it be neat if people in power today wanted to hear the truth?
If we had a resident White House fool,
you know,
who would say, Mr. President, here's what you're really doing.
Well, exactly. Right? I think that we kind of live in a culture where people in power are insulated from truth willfully. They're very happily insulated from what's really going on. So I think that could be a valuable thing if people would, as Shakespeare said, patiently await my medicine.
Now, I have noticed that you jingle a lot as you move.
I do.
So would this have been, well, and this is an authentic costume, I'm assuming. So was
Parts
there a reason?
Of it are.
Would Jane have jingled as she moved through the castle?
Possibly on state occasions or festive occasions. But the one portrait that exists of Jane that's on display in Hampton Court Palace, it's actually part of a triptych of the family of Henry VIII. She's dressed really very simply, with her bald head showing underneath her little cap and with a vapid expression on her face. It's a fantastic picture, but...
So what made you choose Jane as the model?
Well, I thought, you know, because we live in the 21st century and the Victorians sort of took all of the history that happened before them and imposed all of their morals on it, we get this impression throughout all of our education and throughout all our media that women before the Victorian era really had very limited social roles and limited occupations available to them. And when I discovered in the age of Elizabeth, where a woman ruled in her own right, without a king, just absolutely ruled, she said, I will have but one mistress here and no master, to find that there were so many other women who had really fascinating occupations, I thought, a chance to be funny and accidentally teach people. That's what I want to do.
That's a winner.
It is.
And is Jane the first recorded instance that you've been able to find of a woman who had risen to that level?
No, actually, at least 200 years before her in China, there were many female fools. Now, of course, if you go to China today and you try to find written record of that, the People's Cultural Revolution has sort of made it very difficult to find out information about any fools and jesters, because that would suggest that the state is fallible. But and Beatrice Otto also talks about that a lot in her book, which I find fascinating. But there were female fools throughout all of Western Europe. Probably, I wouldn't even know the date of the first one, but there are records of female fools throughout the courts of Western Europe.
Which, again, strikes me, having the 21st century perspective, as being unusual, because you would think in the courts of particularly of the kings, that it was all men. It was all the royalty were men, and all the soldiers were men, and anybody who mattered was a guy. And so here were these women playing this essentially very important role, the truth teller in the court.
It's true, and oftentimes they would be a part of the household of the queen, or part of the households of another titled lady. So they may not have been written about as frequently, but I think that they still definitely played a part.
So in your case, you have done this in England itself.
I have, which was really exciting, because when you're in the States and you play a female court jester, no one believes you. They just, well, what do you mean you're not a barmaid? What do you mean you're not a, they just have these assumptions that cannot be defied. When I visited the United Kingdom and performed as Jane for the first time in the year 2007 for the International Jester Tournament at Muncaster Castle, which has a rich full history.
I love the idea that there is an international jester tournament. That's great.
It happens every year, and it's so much fun. I can't wait to go again. But when I was there in '07 competing for the first time, I was the first female to compete and one of the first 3 Americans to compete. And when I arrived, I didn't ever have to explain to anyone who I was. British school children saw me and said, "You must be Jane the Fool. We've learned about you in lessons. I've got a joke for you." And I just thought that was, I thought, have I died and ascended to a higher level? Because this is all I've ever wanted.
No, that's interesting. And you're right. I have never encountered the character of Jane the Fool until tonight. And a pleasure, I will say it is.
I thank you.
But that English school children know all about Jane the Fool.
They do. Well, that's where the history came from.
Yes, it's true. But I think it's intriguing that the English history would teach that as well,
Yes.
and teach the role of what the Fool did, whereas in America that concept seems to have been lost.
Well, I think that there's a tie to the land and a tie to the houses. It seems to me that a part of the British educational system is to visit the houses and to visit the residences that still exist from a variety of time periods. So, you know, when we stayed at Muncaster Castle, that's the home of the original Tom Fool. That's where he comes from. Thomas Skelton was the fool to the Pennington family in the late 16th century.
From which we get tomfoolery.
That's where the word comes from. He was famous enough that Shakespeare and Marlowe and Kidd all wrote about him.
Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Kidd being the playwrights, the preeminent playwrights of the time.
Exactly.
So, how does such a contest or competition work? Do you tell jokes and get the best laugh?
Well, I wasn't exactly clear on how it was going to work before I went. When I arrived, I discovered that it was really more about variety entertainers, spectacle, juggling things that are on fire, standing on top of very large objects.
Outfit?
Right. I'm highly flammable, so I really should have just lit myself on fire. But I admit that when I first arrived and I saw all of the other competitors who were all amazing jugglers and amazing slapstick artists, prop comedians, all of them completely brilliant, I thought,
What am I
a
doing
lot
here?
of nerve coming here and trying to talk in a fake British accent to actual British people. But I found that even though I didn't prevail in the competition, I did get an amazing consolation prize, which was a bowl made from the wood of Tom Fool's tree.
Wow.
Which I have and I look at every day. But what I found was that there wasn't anyone else at the competition or at the festival who was accustomed to engaging the audience one-on-one the way that I do in character. And so I sort of got to be the girl that talked to everyone. And when, after the competition, when the different numbers of BBC, BBC One, BBC Two, were looking for entertainers to interview, they all kept pointing to me saying, "Talk to the girl, talk to her, she can talk. Talk to the one with the clothes." And so I felt really good about that. Even though I completely bombed in the competition. So.
Well, it's a little hard when you don't know how to prepare for it, right? And everyone else does.
Exactly.
I can understand the problem.
Plus, they're all British. They're automatically funnier than I am, just by virtue of being from England. So,
when you're in America, then,
yes.
and you're here, and you've talked about the educational role. What do you do? What is that? How are you? And who do you educate, and under what circumstances?
The circumstances range from everything pertaining to Renaissance fairs, Shakespeare festivals, street theater festivals, parades, all the way to educational situations and public speaking situations. And I find that most often the way that I teach is first through being bizarre and non-threatening, because people look at me and they're just what?
Can't take you seriously.
What's the what? Invariably, this is the piece that draws the most attention, partly, I'm sure, because of its location, but partly
also
because it is a disembodied smile. And this
the
is
Cheshire Cat.
Exactly. I always tell people that I need to carry a spare in the event of an emergency. You run around with tutors, heads fall off all the time. But I received this as a gift from a stage manager named Stephen Geis many years ago. I received one of these. This is now my 8th one, I think. There's a mask maker in Chicago named Jeff Summerling who has illustrious clients, and I'm happy to be one of them. And I find that this sort of makes me non-threatening to the point where people want to ask questions. Why are you wearing that? Why are you so jingly? Why are you a girl being a jester? Why is your backside so huge? And then invariably, once I answer 1 or 2 questions, they're completely hooked and want to learn everything. So,
By the way, why did the women have those huge backsides?
Right. I think part of it was supposed to make the waist look smaller. No one is fooled. Mine is exaggeratedly large. In the time period, most bum rolls were extremely modest, but I had read an account, possibly erroneous, possibly from the time period. I really need to check a primary source on it. But it's possible that Elizabeth chose to dress Jane in ridiculous excesses of fashion as a warning to the ladies of the court. If ruffs were getting too big, Jane would have one that was 3 feet across. And so if people were starting to look a bit too much like Jane, they needed to reel it back in. So I know that happened with the male fools of the time period. Dick Tarleton would sometimes show up with a 4-foot-long codpiece or, pants that didn't fit through the door just to make fun of everyone who was going in for the latest fad. So.
Yeah, there seems that there's so much of that could be valuable today in
really,
our society.
People need a mirror, and that's throughout at least Western fool history, which is a weird thing to say, but it exists. The fool is a mirror, and in fact, in Danish, the most famous fool, Till Eulenspiegel, his last name can translate to either owl mirror or wise mirror.
So owls being seen as wise,
exactly.
It's more or less the same thing.
Precisely.
So what would be the equivalent today? I mean, if we can think of a character in today or a role that people play.
Jon Stewart. He's our most important fool. I think he's an excellent example of a fool because if you take him at first value, you assume that he's a very wise and learned commentator, and then you realize he's lampooning everything. Or Stephen Colbert, another brilliant fool. Or John Hodgman, one of my favorite fools.
Oh, that's interesting. So those are all politicians. They might be good politicians too, but they're performers who specialize in political humor.
They do.
And so is the role of the fool really to hold up not just a mirror to anybody, but a mirror to society and the values and the politics of the time?
I think so. And if you actually look at fool history on this continent before Europeans arrived, clowns in many First Nations tribes had that specific role where they weren't limited to reflecting things just to the leader or just to the most important people in the community, but they were charged with sort of reining in anyone whose morals were excessive or insufficient. I believe that it's part of the Navajo tradition that their medicine clown, the clown is invested with medicinal strength, and the clown will find someone in the community who's doing something that's untoward, and they will exaggerate that completely. And they'll just follow that person around and mimic them until they get the point. And that person, instead of turning around and punching them, will go, right. Thank you. Thanks for reflecting me.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah,
right.
I get that.
Right. Can you imagine a culture that functions that way?
Yeah,
so great.
I'm sitting here imagining that very culture.
It's utopian. I love it.
And thinking, yes, how wonderful that would be.
It's fooltopian.
Fooltopian. Spelled P-H-O-O-L.
Of course.
Fooltopian. So if we want to think about how we could learn some of these, take some of these lessons and apply them today, short of doing what you're doing, if you want to take that concept into today's world, say you work in your basic office, how do you take those kinds of concepts and make them contemporary?
I think that it's, that's a really fantastic question.
Thank you. That's why I'm here to ask questions.
Exactly.
Just in case you were wondering.
And I'm here to wear the clothes. I think that, I'm trying to think of how I have actually affected that in the workplace. I think that there's an inordinate amount of importance attached to seriousness, which is something that you'd expect me to say, of course. But I think that that people miss the point of most organizations and of most businesses when I often find that it's my role to step into an organization and go, remember the customer, the person who makes it possible for you to be here? You should probably think about them a lot and think less about your own ego, less about your own status, less about your own domination of other people in a hierarchy. And maybe if you really focus on the thing that makes it possible for you to be here, maybe then you can succeed. And I don't get listened to very often.
Well,
but ego is a very powerful thing, and hierarchy is built into us. We're hierarchical animals.
It reminds me of the the famous line that Steve Jobs used to recruit a CEO who shall go nameless because he wasn't very successful at Apple, but he was the head of Pepsi-Cola. And so Steve said to him, "What do you want to spend the rest of your life making sugar water, or do you want to change the world?"
Exactly.
And that's what got him, roped him in.
A lot of my students, when I first introduce them to the concept of changing the world one person at a time, I think some of them maybe tilt their head and scoff, but invariably they come back to me at some point and go, "I think I changed someone's life today. I think I made someone feel more powerful. I think I made somebody feel included in something greater than themselves." And that's super gratifying for me, but I'm also very glad that they've had that experience of just reflecting back to people or including people or elevating people.
Well, one of the things, we had a guest on some months ago who is a lawyer by trade, but is also a stand-up comedian and has performed in many clubs around Chicago.
Not incompatible.
Well, and what he does, I think, is so interesting, and it is in line with, I think, what you're talking about, that he he goes to schools in the inner city, and he finds the teenagers, like high schools, and he finds the teenagers who are sullen and wearing their pants baggy, and they just, and he teaches them how to do stand-up comedy. And the reason he does it is because he said, here's kids who are like, they're 14 or 15, they're trying to be cool, they're trying to figure out, they've constructed this elaborate persona of who they are. Right. And he wants to teach them something different. He wants to teach them, here's how you really express yourself. So he goes in and he takes them and he says that the first day of class, they all sit on their hands and scowl.
Right, of course.
Right? And he says, until the first time they get up and they make someone laugh.
Right. Oh, there's nothing like it.
Changes the entire dynamic of the class. So I'm sure when you were talking, and you talk to students as well, right?
Yes, I do.
Is it similar?
Absolutely. Some of the school programs that I do, when I arrive as Jane the Fool, it can take quite a while to bring
because you walk in like this, right?
Exactly. And it depends on the age, too. The younger the children, the more they associate me with their latest Disney icon. And I'll take it, because if that's a way in, I'll take it. But definitely, once you get people laughing, laughter is a sign that there's been a connection made and that there's commonality. Mm-hmm. And I think that so many people feel a need to create a persona and a need to create a facade because they feel utterly disconnected. We don't really live in a culture that rewards connecting with other people. We do in a superficial way, in a social media kind of way, but really connecting with other people and really realizing that I have life situations in common with you, and we've endured similar trials and we've enjoyed similar victories. I think once you break through that wall, you win.
And humor makes that connection because you made me laugh, so
exactly.
We understand the same. Usually, laughter is it's absurdity in many cases.
It is. It's a physiological reaction to the absurd, but it's not something that you can. It's an unbidden physiological reaction to the absurd.
So do you have an actual routine that you go through when you perform, or is it really off the cuff?
I have perfected, I am told, the fine art of walking around talking to people. I don't tend to do a stage show. I am a walk-around performer, which I didn't really know was a thing until I went to the United Kingdom and saw that that's actually considered a profession there. Here, it's sort of regarded as, well, we need some people in some costumes to take up some space.
Yeah, you go to Disney and somebody runs around as Mickey Mouse. And
exactly. Somebody to stand in a picture with you, somebody sign an autograph for you. But when I went to participate at Muncaster Castle in their Jester tournament and their Festival of Fools, and I learned that you had to join United Kingdom Equity in order to be able to perform because it's genuinely considered an occupation with regulations. Like, you don't do a 10-hour day. You do a 20-minute set, and then you rest for 40 minutes, and then you maybe do a half-hour set. But just to see other cultures where walking around talking to people is a valued thing opened my eyes to a whole new world.
So at the Renaissance fairs where you perform, that's what you do. You walk, just
I walk
mingle
around
with
and
the
talk
crowd.
to people. I may have some functions where I'm on a stage to introduce something or to kick off the day. They usually have me up at the front gate bellowing at the top of my lungs as part of a whimsical little scene. But most of my day is engaging people one-on-one, introducing them to other characters in the show, introducing them to each other, And I've developed this fan base called Fooligans that I have to thank my dear friend Jim for naming them, because it's the best thing that's ever happened. But the Fooligans now sort of have a co-host identity with me. So I introduce them to everyone in the show, and they feel elevated in status and included in the world of the show. And so now they've taken to introducing new people to the show. They bring more and more people through the gate. And they also introduce one another to all sorts of other patrons and other characters in the show. So.
Do they dress up as well?
Some of them do, and some of them don't. It depends.
So how do you break the ice when you're just wandering through the crowd? Or do you wait for people to approach you, or do you just walk up to them?
It depends on the time of day. Usually in the morning, you just have to have a sense about the crowd, which just comes with experience. But for example, at Bristol, the morning crowd tends to be one that wants to see you and doesn't really want to talk to you very much. So I will, instead of trying to ram...
You'll offer them a cup of coffee and just try to get them ramped up? No.
I really should. That's a good idea. But I look for people who look lost and offer to help them read the map and say, you know, I think it's marvelous that you're learning how to read. I admire it. There's pictures for when we get frustrated. What are you looking for? I know where everything is. Do you want to eat, drink, or be merry first? And so when I teach also, I try to reinforce that not everything about walk-around entertainment is constantly ramming your character down the audience's throats. 70% of it is customer service. Just looking for people who need something and giving it to them.
Which actually is pretty easy because you're not really performing, you're just
You'd
interacting.
think it is, but a lot of people get frustrated with it because they're like, but I'm not doing any exposition. And you're like, no one cares until they've been to the bathroom.
Yeah.
Please let them go to the bathroom first, and then they will super care about you.
Yeah.
But
well, and I think the idea of interacting with the people there, I mean, that really is the role that you have. That the people who go to these fairs, and yes, I'm sure there are lots who just want to wander around and not be bothered, but to really experience it, you go there because it's an immersive experience.
Yes, you want to be drawn in, and you want to be a part of the action, and you want to be a part of the action that matters. With the different interactive characters that I train, I've actually been now flown to a number of different shows around the country to come and train their casts in how to interact with audiences, which is a great honor to me. I appreciate it immensely. I am teaching a lot of upper-class characters to assume that the entire audience are also upper-class people. You automatically assume that the audience has a higher status than you because what people want in our culture is to be high status. And maybe if we give people just a taste of what that feels like, maybe they'll take that power back to their actual life and try to flex that a little. Maybe they'll try to elevate people around them and give them a sense of what it feels like to be empowered. So,
You know, believe it or not, we're already out of time.
wow.
I've been fooled into thinking we had longer, but it's not. It's been wonderful having you here. I hope you'll come back.
It's been fantastic talking. Thank you.
So thank you, Jane.
Most
and
well-met gentleman.
And thank you for joining us once again for Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19. And you can find us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you, and have a foolish good night.